Have you been told by your writing instructor that you need to make your writing more descriptive, or it needs to be longer, or it needs more details? Today I'm going to show you actual ways that you can make your writing more descriptive. I know that when I was in school, my teachers would sometimes tell me, oh, you need to write more, it needs to be more descriptive, but they never showed me actually how to do that. Today, that's what we're going to take a look at. So descriptive writing is writing that supports your reader in constructing visual or sensory representations of the text in their heads. It shows, doesn't tell. You've probably heard show, don't tell a lot of times, and I'm going to actually show you how to show, not tell today. And I'm going to show you how to add more details to your writing that will make it more descriptive. So these are the ways that we are going to explore adding more description to your writing today. If you want to skip ahead to one of these mini lessons, the chapters will be listed in the description box below. We are going to be looking at using sensory details, sometimes called imagery. We're going to look at using other types of figurative language like simile, metaphor, allusions, and alliterations. And I'm going to show you how to add explanations, definitions, and a grammatical construction called an appositive to your writing to help it be more descriptive. Writing that supports readers in constructing visual or sensory representations of the text in their heads is called imagery. Imagery appeals to your sense of smell, your visual senses, what you see, the colors you see, the hues you see, the amount of light and darkness you see. The auditory senses, that is the pitch you hear sounds at, the resonance of sounds. Your tactile senses, how things feel if you touch them or if something touches you. And also your sense of taste, which includes sweetness, saltiness, bitterness. Now, if you want to appeal to your reader's sense of smell, you're going to not just say it smelled bad or it smelled good. You are going to write that something was aromatic or citrusy or minty or fragrant or foul smelling. And you could even go into more detail and describe what type of foul smelling it was. Maybe it was the smell of a sewer. Maybe it was the smell of rotted food. These appeal to your reader's sense of smell, and they can really add that description that brings the text to life for them. If you're going to appeal to your reader's sense of sight, you want to use words like gloomy, dazzling, bright, foggy, gigantic, appealing to how they interpret size or brightness, or even fogginess and clearness in the air. Adding this sort of description is more helpful to your reader than to just say something looked good, or it looked bad, or it looked scary. Tell how it achieves that particular goodness or badness or scariness by using particular vocabulary. Likewise, you're going to appeal to your reader's auditory senses when you use words like bellowed, or blared, or buzzing, or cackling, or cheering, or clamoring. These kinds of words are very specific to certain actions, and they are more descriptive and help your reader understand your text better. If you want to appeal to your reader's tactile senses, that is their sense of touch and feel, you're going to use words like biting to describe the coldness, bristly to describe how something feels, or velvety, bumpy, freezing, coarse. Anything other than just saying that it felt good against their skin or it felt bad against their skin, maybe when describing a piece of clothing. You use the very specific vocabulary to appeal to your reader's senses. Now, to appeal to your reader's sense of taste, you wouldn't want to just say something tasted good or it tasted bad. You want to be more specific and use words like bitter, bland, creamy, spicy, salty, anything that can stir a memory for them or make them think of something that will help them interpret your text the way you want it to be interpreted. Now, I want to give you an example of how an actual author uses these imagery words in his writing to convey really specific meanings. And the excerpt we're going to look at today is from Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this is an excerpt from the very first chapter, which is called The Story of the Door. If you're familiar with the story, if you're not, you probably want to read it someday. Lots of great examples of descriptive writing in this story. First of all, I'm just going to read through the paragraph, and I want you to notice that I have highlighted some words in yellow. I'm going to come back and talk about those words after we've read through the paragraph, but those are the descriptive words that really bring this particular excerpt to life. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood, like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. Now, before we go on and talk about the entire excerpt, I just want to point out to you, this passenger is not someone who's writing something. It's a passenger who's passing by, walking. A little bit different use, but this text was written over 100 years ago, so words were used a little bit differently then. So let's take a look at some of these yellow highlighted descriptive words and phrases. It chanced on one of these rambles. Now, the two men who are the focus of this first chapter, they go on a walk together every Sunday afternoon. And by rambling, you can picture in your head that they're just kind of slowly, casually walking along. They're not power walking, they're not skipping, they're not creeping, they're just keeping up a nice pace, rambling along, and they always have good talks together when they're walking, rambling on Sunday afternoons together. That their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. Now, a by-street is not a main street. It's also not a back alley. If you think of a main street going down a town and then consider the cross streets, those are the by-streets. Not the main street, but the streets that come off of the main street. So this, again, helps you to picture in your head that this is not a main street, but it's not really a back street either. It's a by street in a busy quarter of London. I could have probably highlighted that as well. Busy means there's a lot going on. In a quarter of London, it would be just a section of London, a fourth, but a quarter is sometimes just used to refer to a particular section of a town. The street was small. He used a pretty general word here. But then he goes on and gives more description, so that's okay. And what is called quiet. Okay, it's not a bustling street. Now remember, quiet back then was different from quiet now. Quiet nowadays means there's not very many automobiles going by, but when this was written, it meant there weren't a lot of horses and carriages going by on the street. But it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms. Now on Sunday, obviously the shops are going to be shuttered, and veil is another word for shutter. So they're closed off, but even though you can't see the charms that you can see on the days when the shutters are down and there are displays out front, signs out front, it lay comparatively empty of passage. So nobody's walking on these by streets on this Sunday afternoon. But even though nobody's walking by and the shops are shuttered or veiled, the street shines out in contrast. So if something shines, that means that it's easy to recognize, it's bright, it's probably somewhat alluring, and the people enjoy walking down that street even on this Sunday when all the shops are closed, because that's in contrast to its dingy neighborhood. So this particular part of the street with the shops was very attractive, whereas the rest of the neighborhood, maybe going on down the street or into the back alleys, is dingy. And dingy we think of as dark and dirty. And it's shining out in contrast like a fire in a forest. And a little bit later we'll talk about simile, but this indeed is a simile here. A fire definitely shines out in a forest, just like these shops shine out on this street, even on the days that they're veiled or shuttered. With its freshly painted shutters, okay, freshly painted, they're nice and clean, they're bright. Well-polished brasses, so the handles and the locks and the hinges are well polished, they're not dingy and dark. And general cleanliness, so there's not a lot of rubbish on the ground, everything has been swept up and it's nice and clean, and gaiety of note. And otherwise, it's a happy place to be in general. Make note of that. It instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. So again, he's describing a section of the town where even on Sunday, when all the shops are closed, it's an attractive, quiet place to take a nice leisurely walk. Now, besides imagery, there are other kinds of figurative language that can be used to help readers make associations between what they know and the descriptive images invoked by the text. In other words, help your reader connect to your text. These other types of figurative language, which you may already be familiar with, are simile, metaphor, allusion, and alliteration. Adding these to your writing will make it more descriptive. Let's look at some examples. Example from another chapter in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's from the chapter entitled The Search for Mr. Hyde. And pay attention as I read that the yellow highlight is the simile, and see how it helps you to connect this text and get an image in your head that helps you actually see what the author is talking about. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine dry night, frost in the air, and streets as clean as a ballroom floor. The lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. Now this is very descriptive in more ways than just the simile, but we're just going to look at the simile here. Clean as a ballroom floor helps you to picture something that is, even though it's dark, it's shiny and it's clean. Likewise, adding metaphor, that is not when you say something is like or as something else, but where you just say something is something else unrelated. That metaphor can also help you add from a chapter entitled The Carew Murder Case, also from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Here's the passage. The old gentleman took a step back with the air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt. And at that, Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth. The next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped upon the roadway. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. Now, I'm sorry, that is a pretty brutal scene that we're looking at here, but I want to specifically look at this metaphor of comparing this beating to a storm. In a storm, storms are relentless. They just keep coming. They just keep having wind and hail and rain and thunder and lightning. And this is how this attack was that's described in the Carew murder case. When Carew was murdered by Mr. Hyde, the attack was like a storm. It just kept coming. Now, another way that you can add description to your writing, and this can be really fun actually, is to make an allusion to something else outside of your story. Now, people often make allusions to stories in other books. You might make an allusion to a television show or a movie. Often people make allusions to things in the Bible. And these, again, are ways of helping your reader connect with your text, what they already know, bring it to your text, and this description helps them understand your text better. Let's take a look at one more example from The Search for Mr. Hyde in the story The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. This is an allusion to the game hide and seek. Now, the author could have said Mr. Utterson was playing a game of hide and seek with this brutal killer in order to catch him and to capture him. But instead, he's more clever. He uses it in an allusion by saying, if he be Mr. Hyde, well, then I shall be Mr. Seek. This is a great way that you can add description to your writing. Again, you're not going to want to do it on every page or in every paragraph, but used together with other descriptive writing techniques, it can be very effective. Okay, another way that you can add description to your writing is by using alliteration. And this is actually kind of fun. And again, Robert Louis Stevenson does this expertly in his chapter, The Search for Mr. Hyde. Here's the excerpt. The steps drew swiftly nearer and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned the end of the street. Lots of S's there. It kind of gives you that feeling that he's sliding along through this whole excerpt because the steps are drawing nearer to him, they're getting louder, and then all of a sudden he turns around the corner. So I just kind of picture him sliding around as the steps grew swiftly nearer and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned at the end of the street. Alliteration can be very helpful, but again, you don't want to use it in every paragraph or in every page. If you're writing a little short story for school, maybe one section of alliteration or two is all you need to help you with the description. Now, even if your teacher hasn't told you you need to be more descriptive, there's a pretty good chance that they've told you you need to add more details. Well, how do you do that? I'm going to give you some actual tools that will help you to be able to add more description by adding more details. The three ways we're going to look at today in this lesson are explanations, definitions, and a grammatical construction called an appositive. Now, adding explanations are very helpful for your reader, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, because they go beyond just that main sentence and they give an explanation of why or how or when something happened. Here's another passage from the Carew murder case that gives a description of the witness who saw the murder actually happening. The base of this sentence says, it seems she was romantically given. Now, had he stopped there, you might have just thought in reading this that this witness is really into falling in love and being romantic. Well, there's more than one definition of romantic, and it becomes clear as Stevenson adds an explanation to this beginning sentence. It seems she was romantically given for, or because, she sat down upon her box, which stood immediately under the window, and fell into a dream of musing. So in this case, romantically is not necessarily just having to do with love, but it's having to do with someone who is maybe adventuresome or a dreamer. And you see here that she sits down on her box. She might be kind of poor because she's only got a box to sit on, not a chair. That's a lesson that we could go into another time. Which stood immediately under the window. And of course she sees this murder happen from her window. She falls into a dream of musing. So she's just letting her thoughts take her wherever, just thinking about whatever comes to mind. This explanation adds a lot more to that starting part of the sentence that just says, it seems like she was romantically given. An explanation helps the excerpt be more descriptive because it adds more details about what's actually going on, what you might see if you were witnessing her witness the murder. Another way that I like to add description type details to my writing, especially in nonfiction writing, but it works in fiction writing as well, is to add a definition or tell more about something. So in the chapter, The Incident of the Letter, Stevenson writes, "At the further end, a flight of stairs mounted to a door covered with red baize. Through this, Mr. Utterson was at last received into the doctor's cabinet." Had he left it there? I think of a cabinet as like a cupboard in the kitchen, and it's kind of small. And I wouldn't want to have to go get into a cabinet. But he adds a definition for how this word cabinet was used at this point in history, and it gives you a better idea of just exactly where Mr. Utterson was received by Dr. Jekyll. Here is the definition of a doctor's cabinet. It was a large room fitted round with glass presses, furnished, among other things, with a cheval glass, which is a large oblong type mirror that you can take a look at yourself in, and a business table, maybe a type of desk, or a table used for meetings. We're not really sure here. He could have gone into more definition on the table for sure. And looking out upon the court by 3 dusty windows barred with iron. So you see, this isn't just a small cabinet or cupboard, but this cabinet is actually his office. Had Stevenson not added that further definition, the reader might have been left thinking that these two guys got into a kitchen type cupboard together and all this other stuff was not even mentioned, so you wouldn't even have known that they were having a meeting here. And finally, one of my favorite types of details to add to writing is a grammatical construction called an appositive. An appositive is a noun phrase, again, that's a lesson for another video, but it's a noun phrase that renames the noun that came before it and gives you further explanation of that particular noun. Here from the chapter, The Incident of the Letter, is another excerpt where Stevenson uses an appositive to help the reader understand who a particular character is. Presently, after he sat on one side of his own hearth with Mr. Guest, his head clerk, upon the other, and midway between, at a nicely calculated distance from the fire, a bottle of particular old wine that had long dwelt unsunned in the foundations of his house. Wow, there's a lot of description here, but we're only going to look at the appositive. When Stevenson writes his head clerk, he's just giving you another name for Mr. Guest. Now, don't be thinking here that Mr. Guest is a guest. This is a capital G on this name, which means it's his proper name, Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest is his head clerk. So by giving that further definition, that renaming of that proper noun, it gives you more information, more detail, more description of who Mr. Guest is. Now, this is something that you could probably use in just about every paragraph of your writing. This never gets old. I hope that this lesson on using sensory details, which is called imagery, as well as simile, metaphor, allusion, and alliteration, and explanations, definitions, and appositives, helps you get started adding more description to your writing. If you'd like more details or a more in-depth lesson on any of these approaches, please leave a comment down below. If you're not subscribed to the Never Stop Learning channel, please subscribe, and if this was helpful to you, please give it a thumbs up and share this video with a fellow writer or maybe even a fellow teacher. If you are a teacher and you would like a copy of the slides that I used in this particular video lesson, I'm going to be putting these slides on my Teachers Pay Teachers store for free, so you can link to them in the description below and then download them for free from Teachers Pay Teachers to use in your own classroom. Thanks so much for watching, and never stop learning.